A very warm welcome to all of you. In today's lecture, we'll do migration networks, network theory in migration studies, right? So the concept of migration networks or the concept of social networks in migration is very well known. And what I'm going to do today is I'm going to take you through a seminal paper on by Douglas Massey and his colleagues that was published in 1998. On migration networks and network theory in migration studies. So this paper is in the context of international migration, and as you know that this is unlike neoclassical theory where which is individual oriented, which argues that migration is due to migration is due to differences in wages, in income between source and destination region, migration is due to disequilibrium. The network theory has very different ways of looking at migration, right? So today we will focus on the social network theory, right? So migrant networks can be defined as sets of interpersonal ties that connect migrants, former migrants and non-migrants in origin and destination areas through ties of kinship, friendship and shared community origin. So that's the broad definition of migrant networks that Douglas Massey and his colleagues use. And so therefore, it's only logical, it's only rational that networks increase the likelihood of migration. And why is this? This is because networks obviously lower the cost of migration. If you migrate through your friends, through your family, through your kins, the costs of migration are lowered, and it also lowers the risk of movement, right? So then due to lower costs and lower risk, the increase in expected net returns to migration occurs, right? So then in that sense, network connections are really a form of social capital that people can draw upon to gain access to employment. Now, what do we mean by social capital? Social capital, some of you may be familiar with Robert Putnam's work on social capital. Social capital is nothing but features of social organizations such as networks, norms, trust that facilitate action and cooperation for mutual benefit, right? So then if we look at it like this, social capital can also it can also inspire people to migrate, and Dehas sort of tells us this. And through the network theory, therefore, once the number of migrants reach a critical threshold, the expansion of network then reduces the costs of movement, it reduces the risks of movement, and then this causes the probability of migration to rise, which then causes additional movement, which further expands network, and so on, right? So then over time, Massey and his colleagues argue that migratory behavior spreads outward to encompass broader segments of the sending society. So initially, migration is selective, and then over time, as networks develop, as networks grow, it is only normal and natural for it to spread across all sections of the society, and this is something that we also see empirically in many migration streams. Let's talk a little bit more about the costs. Now, migration is particularly costly for first migrants. Now, why might this be so? Well, this is of course because they have no social ties to draw on from in the destination region, but it also involves going to other countries often without any documents. And so if one is going without any documents, if one is in irregular migration, then the costs can be quite high. And then after the first set of migrants have left, the potential cost to migrants, the next set of migrants and the next set of migrants, the potential cost of subsequent migrants are lowered. And they are lowered then for friends, for family left behind who might migrate in the future, right? And this is where kinship, friendship structures, all of this comes in, right? Because each migrant then creates a set of people with social ties in the destination area. The other thing is that migrants are inevitably linked to non-migrants, right? And so what do we mean by this? So So, you know, in neoclassical theory, you clearly distinguish between migrants and non-migrants, and you say that there is a selectivity of migrants. Everybody doesn't migrate, only some people migrate, right? So what network theory says is, okay, migrants and non-migrants might be two distinct entities, but it also looks at the networks and connections between the migrant and non-migrant, and it argues that over time it is possible that through kinship, friendship structure, the non-migrants draw upon obligations implicit in friendships and kinship relationships to gain access to employment and assistance when they reach the destination, when they decide to migrate. So, so you see, migrants are then inevitably linked to non-migrants. And this is largely because non-migrants draw upon their obligations, non-migrants draw upon the obligations in the relationship that they have with the migrants, and you know, the kinship, the friendship, all of these networks then help them gain access to employment and also assistance at the point of destination if they choose to become migrants, right? And then once the number of network connections in an origin area reaches the critical threshold, migration becomes self-perpetuating. And this is because each act of migration itself creates the social structure needed to sustain it. So this is really fundamental. You know, in the beginning you have migrant networks which are weak, and over time migration is back and forth. You have more and more migrants through the network moving and migrating, and then eventually when migration reaches a critical mass, when the number of networks reaches a critical mass, this migration becomes self-perpetuating, right? And that's because every act of migration that has happened, it creates a structure to sustain it, right? So what's really happening is every new migrant is reducing the cost of subsequent migration for a set of friends and relatives, and some of these people therefore are induced to migrate, which further expands the set of people with ties around them, and then you have more people migrating, and then more people migrating. And I'm sure you can think of context, think of empirical examples when this happens. So therefore, and this is very different from neoclassical theory, which tells us that migration happens because of wage differences or because of income differences between source and destination regions. And then we'll see then, you know, what the implications of network theory are. They're very different for policy, they're very different for individuals compared to neoclassical theory that we've looked at earlier. What else do networks do? So let's talk a little bit about the declining risks of network. So networks also make migration extremely attractive as a strategy for risk diversification. So when migrant networks are well developed, they put a destination job within easy reach for most community members, and therefore emigration becomes reliable. Emigration is reliable and then becomes a secure source of income. So then the self-sustaining growth of networks that occurs because of the reduction of costs, because of the reduction of risks, this is something then which continues, right? As every new migrant is expanding the network, he's reducing the risk of movement, and he's doing this for everybody who he or she is related to, and eventually migration then becomes virtually risk-free and virtually costless. This is what Massey and his colleagues argue, that over time, because of enhanced social networks, migration becomes risk-free and costless, and therefore households diversify their labor allocations through emigration. Now, so this very dynamic theory, this very dynamic social network theory, it accepts migration, whether it's international migration or internal migration, it accepts migration as an individual or a household decision process, that it does. So this is like new economics of labor migration. It accepts it as an individual or a household decision, but it argues that that acts of migration at one point in time systematically alter the context within which future migration decisions are made. So therefore, people are affected by other people moving. So the act of migration at one point systematically affects future courses of migration, and then this goes on to alter the context within which future migration decisions are made. And then this greatly increases the likelihood that those later would choose to migrate. So what's the counterfactual here? The counterfactual is that if you did not have initial migration, if you did not have that through social networks, then the likelihood of migration increasing, it becoming self-perpetuating, and would not happen. So now, what does DeHaas have to say on network theory? So DeHaas argues that once a critical mass of migrants have settled at destination, then subsequent migration patterns are affected by, of course, the choices that were made by pioneer migrants, but also labor recruiters influence subsequent migration patterns, right? So then migration facilitates the flow of information from the place of destination to origin, and then that facilitates the pattern for later migrants. So information is really important, communication is really important. When non-migrants see, it could be the benefit of remittances, it could be the impact of migration, and then they might want to also migrate. So that's fundamentally network theory sort of working out, right? So what you have is already settled migrants, they function as bridgeheads. Now the term bridgeheads is used by Bauckham in a 1994 publication, and so already settled migrants act as a bridgehead, right? So they are literally the bridge between someone aspiring to migrate and going to the place of destination. And these bridgeheads then, they not only do they reduce the risk, but also reduce the material and psychological cost of subsequent migration. So then we can see very clearly that economic forces alone do not explain migration patterns, they do not explain the creation of new migration patterns. And so migration networks are important, social networks are important, and there's also, this also kind of, results in chain migration. So now there are plenty of empirical studies on the network theory, right? A lot of them are in the context of Latin America, how social networks have been very critical in migrants from countries in Latin America, especially Mexico, migrating to the United States and so on. But one of the main issues with network theory is that in the long term, migration decreases, and when the fundamental causes of migration disappear, right? So then network theory is not able to explain why migration decreases when it does, because social networks are supposed to, go on ad infinitum, right? So why is it that networks weaken? Why do they crumble? That is something that we don't know, right? And according to network theory, migration will go on ad infinitum, but we know empirically that does not happen. So, so that's it's a bit of a black box of network theory, right? Now, network theories also don't tell us what the external structural factors as well as the internal processes are that counteract the tendencies that lead to increasing migration through networks, right? So, now that is something also network theory is unable to tell us. So, then fundamentally, if migration decreases, when the fundamental causes of migration disappear, then network theory becomes very, network theory is unable to explain the decrease in migration. The other thing is that you have other kinds of barriers that impact the nature and magnitude of migration. You can have legal barriers, you can have physical barriers. The example of policy, changing American policy towards migration is a relevant example here. So, the President of the United States has been committed to making a wall across the Mexican border, right? So that's literally a physical barrier. Now, your social networks can be really strong, but they will find it hard to overcome such barriers, right? Similarly, recently there's been a shake-up of the H-1B immigration visa, and so that's a legal barrier, right? That's a way of reducing or trying to stop legal migration. So then, therefore, you have a situation also where De Haas argues that internal forces may weaken migration over time. So we saw the example of bridgeheads earlier, bridgeheads that help facilitate migration, that they help new migrants settle in. But you also have gatekeepers, right? Now, who are the gatekeepers? Gatekeepers are early migrants, people who migrated earlier, but once they have migrated, after some point of time or immediately, they are hesitant or unwilling to assist prospective migrants, right? So, if current migrants are unwilling or hesitant to assist prospective migrants, then you have a situation where social networks don't really work. They will not work, right? So then, similarly, there are other forces that weaken migration over time, and one of the main downsides of social capital is that the same ties, the same strong ties that help migrant members of a group often exclude others in a group, right? This is something that's very critical because social capital is something, so then social capital then becomes the means through which you're able to exclude others, right? And then network theory doesn't really explain to us why is it that there's a weakening and crumbling of networks in some cases. So to summarize, Massey et al. Argue, once international migration has begun, and this is the truth, the same is true for internal migration as well, though their conceptualization is in the context of international migration. Once international migration has begun, it tends to expand over time until the network connections have diffused so widely in a sending region that all the people who wish to migrate can do so without difficulty, then migration begins to decelerate. So, you see an acceleration of migration with social networks being operational and working their way and so on, but networks also saturate, right? Once there's already high migration, once migration has reached saturation and everybody who wishes to migrate has already been able to migrate, then migration will decelerate, right? And furthermore, the network theory argues in response to neoclassical theory or countering neoclassical theory, saying, so the migration between two countries is not really so much a function of wage differentials or employment rates and so on, but what it is a function of is those variables that either promote or inhibit migration with respect to falling costs, risk of movement, and all of that comes from the growth of migrant networks over time, right? So, it's not wage differential per se, it's not employment rate per se, but whatever effects these variables have in connection with the falling costs and risk of movements that come from the growth of migration networks over time. And then furthermore, as international migration becomes institutionalized through the formation and elaboration of networks, it then becomes progressively independent of the factors that originally caused it, be they structural or individual. So, again, this is also very, very critical, right? The third point is very critical about the institutionalization of international migration. Once it's happened, once migration, international migration or internal migration has been institutionalized through through networks, then it becomes independent of other factors or other causes because networks themselves become very, very strong. The fourth point they mention is that as networks expand, the costs and risks of migration fall, and then the flow of migration becomes less selective in socioeconomic terms and more representative of the sending community. Now, just like I was mentioning earlier, migration is selective, The act of migration is not random. It is selective and it's based on all kinds of individual, household, community characteristics and so on. But what network theory tells us is that, okay, migration tends to increase with social networks, right? And when it's increasing and when it reaches a critical mass, it tends to become less selective. And once it's less selective, then it's obviously more representative, because more and more communities, more and more individuals are then migrating and becoming a part of the migration process. So therefore, the fifth point, governments can expect to have great difficulty in controlling flows once they have begun, because the process of network formation lies largely outside their control and occurs no matter what policy regime is pursued. So this is very interesting. What network theory is telling us is that, government policy doesn't matter. Migration happens largely because of social networks, because of individual networks, and these bypass government policy. So this is again a very, very powerful way of looking at migration. A lot of international labour migration, evades any kind of policy at destination. From India, a lot of the donkey migration routes are also coming from these spaces, right? Where you have social networks and you're able to bypass the state, you're able to bypass the law, whatever the law that time is, and so on. But we also know, this whole recent example of a very hard stand of immigration that the United States has taken. We also know that that policies can make a difference, and if policies are very hard, like they are right now, clearly they will have some kind of a dampening on other factors that explain migration, even though social networks exist, right? And so the other point that they make, and the sixth point is actually very, very important in the context of when the paper was written, and it was actually sort of summarizing and reviewing a lot of literature over the last couple of decades. And in that context, they find that certain immigration policies, which are, and they, so there were a lot of immigration policies which look at reunification, family reunification. And so they argue that certain immigration policies, such as those intended to promote reunification between immigrants and their families abroad, work at cross purposes with the control of migration flows, right? And why is that? This is largely because they give members of kin networks special rights of entry, right? So immigration policy that favors, facilitates family reunification, then is an immigration policy that endorses social networks. So so therefore, if now this is again written from the perspective of policy for a destination state, right? So if the goal of policy is to control immigration flows, then of course what family reunification policies do is that they actually don't control immigration flows. But the other side of this is that if migrants are individuals with rights, they clearly have the right to live with their family, and that is also something to think about, right? So what I'm going to do now is, I'm just going to take you through some of my own empirical work on Bihar migration to understand, a little more about social networks and how they operate empirically and so on, right? So I'm going to do two things. The first thing is that I'm going to take you through some survey data, and I'm going to show you results of a survey data. This survey was conducted in 2016. It was a migration module that was done as part of a household survey at my work at the Institute for Human Development in New Delhi. And so the study broadly looked at longitudinal change, social and economic change in rural Bihar, and it was done in 6 districts in Bihar. The districts were Gaya, Gopalganj, Nalanda, Purnia, Madhubani and Rohtas. So, the initial study was done in 6 districts, but over time it became 7 districts. So, Purnia and Araria were 1 district. So what we have is that we had a sample of 906 workers, right? And the pie chart that you see over here, the pie chart here is an answer by the 906 workers, or answers for 906 workers on how their migration was organized, right? Now you see the purple section is the most common response, right? So about 60% of the workers said that their migration was organized by either their relatives or their friends, right? So there it is, you know, a majority of workers actually go through social networks, right? That's how they go for work, right? And then the second part is, you know, the blue one that you can see. It's about 1/4 of all workers, and so about 1/4 of all workers went on their own knowledge. But for many of these workers, you know, their initial migration, their first migrations actually through social networks, and then that becomes their own knowledge and so on. So there's a bit of an overlap between blue and between the blue and the purple, right? And then the green one, there's local intermediary, which is again, you know, a part of social networks. The light blue one is villagers seeking work in a group. Again, that's social network. You're going together. You are looking for work in a group, right? And then, so you can see that the orange one there is pre-arranged job. A very, very small proportion of migrants actually had a pre-arranged job, right? For everybody else and for a majority of migrant workers, they access employment through social networks. And so that is something which is not kind of restricted only to Bihar migration. There's work I've done more recently in Odisha, and we find that, and largely in rural urban migration, social in the context of India, in most contexts in India, much of the employment, access to employment is through social networks, just like Massey and his colleague argue in the context of international migration. The second example I want to take you through is a more qualitative example, and this is the case of MG. MG is 26 years old, and I will read it to you. And then as I read it, you know, the specific areas of this which are more important for the social networks theory is something that I will talk about, right? And this is MG's own account, and I will read MG's own account. So I quote, "When I first came to Delhi, I was only 13 years old. My friend and I took the train to Delhi and reached Nataraj Cinema, a landmark we knew from migrants' conversations in the village." So, MG is a 26-year-old migrant from the district of Madhubani to Delhi. Madhubani is a district in Bihar, and Madhubani to Delhi is one of the most dense migration corridors in India. And it's a context of migration the migration context is that of low agricultural productivity, lack of employment options, and floods. You have floods that happen very often in Madhubani. And so when MG came to Delhi, he was only 13 years old. And the only way he could have had a foothold in Delhi, was because he came because he had fellow villagers, right? So clearly we see social networks are so important that even for a young 13-year-old boy, he could leave his village and he could come to Delhi because he knew that he would have fellow villagers there. And then, and as you can see from the story, that the fellow villagers actually helped him find a job, and that's how. So access to employment, access to housing, all of that is done, mediated through social networks. So social networks are clearly very, very important empirically in understanding migration in many contexts in India. So now we come to the end of this section on social networks. The main reading we've used is the review paper by Douglas Massey and his colleagues. We've also drawn on Dehas's work his seminal working paper on migration and development, and the examples that I used, the empirical examples that I used, that they have been used from my work on Bihar migration. So with that, we come to the end of this segment. Thank you so much.